The morning Martha Lewis decided to leave, the sky hung low and white over Mill Creek, the kind of sky that warned of heavy snow before a single flake had fallen. The old wooden house creaked in the wind, as if it already knew winter was coming for it. Inside, the air felt colder than outdoors. Her husband Frank had left before dawn. He always did. Not with anger, not with shouting, just silence. He spent his days in town and his nights somewhere else, and his money on things that never became food or firewood. There were no bruises on Martha's arms, no broken plates on the floor, just emptiness, a slow kind of neglect that made the walls feel farther apart every day. Martha stood by the door and wrapped a faded scarf around her daughter's neck. Lily, 8 years old and already too quiet for her age, held a small cloth doll under one arm. The doll's yarn hair was tangled, but Lily had brushed it that morning like it mattered. "We're going on a walk," Martha said gently. Lily looked around the house, the thin blanket on the couch, the empty cupboard, the cold stove. She didn't ask where they were going. She just nodded. They took only what they could carry: a quilt, a skillet, a knife, a box of matches, and a sack of cornmeal Martha had hidden beneath a loose floorboard weeks ago. The door closed behind them with a dull sound that felt heavier than it should have. They followed the frozen dirt road north, past the last row of houses, past the church with its crooked bell tower. Snow began to fall in soft, lazy flakes. Their boots left two narrow lines behind them, quickly swallowed by white. By noon, the land rose into low hills, and the trees thickened into pine and oak. Lily's cheeks were red from the cold. Martha stopped and knelt to fix her mitten, her fingers stiff and aching. "That farm over there," Martha said, pointing. "We'll rest there." The place had been abandoned for years. The barn leaned to one side, its roof sagging under old snow. Wind whistled through broken boards. It looked like the kind of place people warn their children about. But to Martha, it looked like shelter. She walked around the barn slowly, her boots crunching over frozen ground. Near the back corner, she noticed a hollow in the snow where the earth dipped lower. She brushed it away with her hands and uncovered a wooden hatch set into the ground. Martha hesitated, then she pulled. The door opened with a long, tired groan. Cold air rose from below, but it wasn't moving. No wind, no open draft, just stillness. She struck a match. The flame revealed a narrow ladder leading down into packed earth, and beyond it, a low, rounded chamber carved into the soil. It wasn't pretty. The walls were dirt and stone. Old straw rotted on the floor. Roots hung like thin fingers from the ceiling. But it was quiet, and it was hidden. Martha looked at Lily. The girl stood close, gripping her doll with both hands. "Tonight," Martha said softly, "this is our house." Lily didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just stepped forward and climbed down the ladder. The first night passed with little sleep. The ground beneath the quilt was cold and damp, and every sound from above, wind scraping the barn boards, snow sliding off the roof, felt louder underground. Martha kept the small lantern burning low to save oil, its weak light barely touching the curved dirt walls. Lily slept curled against her side, the cloth doll pressed under her chin like a shield. By morning, Martha's back ached and her hands were stiff with cold. She knew one thing for sure. If they stayed like this, they wouldn't last a week. "We fix it," she said aloud, more to herself than to Lily. She sent Lily up the ladder with one rule: stay where I can hear you. The barn was full of broken things, but broken didn't mean useless. Lily returned dragging a rusted lantern and a bundle of dry sticks she'd found wedged between fallen boards. Martha trimmed the wick with her knife and lit it. The flame caught, steady and amber. For the first time, the chamber didn't feel like a grave. It felt like a room. Warmth came next. Martha stacked stones into a low circle against the driest wall and built a small fire inside it. Smoke gathered near the ceiling and burned their eyes until Martha followed the thin drift of it toward a narrow crack at the back of the chamber. She climbed out and traced it to a split in the frozen earth near the barn's foundation. With her knife in bare hands, she widened the opening. When she came back down, the smoke lifted and pulled away like it had found its path. Lily clapped once, quiet and careful. "It's working!" Martha nodded. Her chest felt lighter than it had in days. They ate thin cornmeal mush for breakfast, cooked in the skillet over the fire. It tasted like nothing, but it was hot, and that was enough. Next came the floor. The earth sweated cold into their clothes. Martha pried loose long planks from the barn's inner wall, using a bent hammer she found in the straw. She carried them down one by one, laying them side by side. Lily followed with handfuls of dry hay and dead leaves, stuffing them into the gaps. When the last board was set, Martha stood and tested it with her weight. The chill from below faded, replaced by something close to comfort. "Better," she said. Lily bounced once on the new floor and smiled for the first time since they'd left Mill Creek. The walls came after. Moisture clung to the dirt, darkening it. Martha drove thin stakes into the soil and leaned planks against them, leaving a narrow space between wood and earth. Trapped air, she knew, could be as powerful as blankets. Lily handed her nails from a tin cup, counting them softly as Martha worked. That night, the shelter smelled of smoke and damp wood, but it was warm enough that they took off their coats. Lily hung her doll on a bent nail near the bed and declared it a wall hook. They made soup from water and the last of the cornmeal. Martha watched Lily eat and felt the quiet weight of responsibility settle deeper into her bones. There was no one else coming, no one else fixing things. Outside, snow fell hard against the barn roof. Inside, the fire reflected off the lantern glass and turned the dirt walls gold. It wasn't a house, but it was becoming a place where they could breathe. By the third day, smoke from their hidden fire began to show itself above the snow. It rose in a thin, steady line near the collapsed barn, faint but visible against the gray sky. Martha noticed it first when she climbed out to gather wood. She felt a tight pull in her chest. Smoke meant warmth, but it also meant eyes. Before noon, voices drifted through the trees. Two men from Mill Creek stood near the barn, stamping their boots and laughing. One of them, Tom Parker, had once borrowed Frank's truck and never returned it. "Well, look at this," Tom said. "Living underground now? Like prairie dogs." Martha stood at the hatch, her shoulders squared. "We're staying warm," she said. Tom snorted. "Warm in a dirt hole? That won't last when real winter hits." They walked away shaking their heads, their laughter thin and sharp in the cold air. Martha waited until their footsteps faded before climbing back down. Lily looked up from the fire, her eyes wide. Were they mad?" "No," Martha said. "They were wrong." But that night, as the wind howled across the fields and snow packed itself against the barn walls, doubt crept in. The fire burned low, and the cold pressed in from every direction, like something alive. The temperature dropped hard. By morning, the world above was frozen solid, the snow crusted like glass. Martha's breath stung her lungs as she worked. Her fingers burned as she hauled dead branches from beneath drifts. Inside the shelter, the walls wept with moisture. Smoke drifted back toward the floor, heavy and sour. Lily coughed and pressed her doll to her chest. "We need more food," Lily said quietly, "and more wood." Martha nodded. She had already been thinking the same thing. That afternoon, she found a coil of wire in the barn and bent it into a crude snare. She set it near the tree line where tracks crossed the snow. It felt like guessing, like hoping. That night, the wind screamed through the broken boards above them. Snow slid off the roof in long, muffled sighs. The fire fought to stay alive, chewing through wood faster than Martha could replace it. Lily curled up under the quilt. "Mom?" "Yes. What if the door gets buried?" Martha pictured the hatch sealed under 10 feet of snow. The dark, the cold, no way out. She reached for Lily's hand. "Then we dig, and we keep digging." Lily nodded, though her mouth trembled. In the morning, the snare was empty. So was the second one. They ate thin soup made from dried roots Martha dug up behind the barn. It tasted bitter, but it filled space in their stomachs. That afternoon, the cold hit harder than before. Ice formed along the inside walls. Smoke clung to the ceiling instead of rising. Martha studied the fire, the airflow, the narrow crack behind the chamber. Heat rises, she thought, but it has to be guided. She dragged a rusted sheet of tin from the corner of the barn and cut it into rough panels using the edge of a broken plow blade. She angled one piece behind the fire to push heat forward. Another she placed above it, shaping a narrow throat for the smoke. The change was immediate. The flame sharpened. The smoke lifted cleanly and vanished into the crack like it had been taught where to go. Lily clapped her hands once, then stopped herself. It worked. Martha felt something loosen inside her chest. That evening, she checked the snare again. A rabbit lay still in the snow, its body warm. She carried it back with shaking hands. They cooked it slowly, every part used, every drop of fat saved. Outside, the wind still raged. Inside, the fire burned brighter. And for the first time since leaving Mill Creek, Martha believed they might last the winter. By the end of the second week, the shelter had found its rhythm. Martha rose before daylight, dug the hatch clear, and gathered wood while the world above stayed silent and white. Lily stayed below and fed the fire, learning the sound of healthy flames and the smell of clean smoke. Their small room no longer felt like a hole in the ground. It felt shaped by hands and intention. Planks along the walls, clay packed into the cracks, a raised bed filled with straw and covered by the quilt. They were still hungry, but they were warm. The cold deepened anyway. Nights came earlier. Wind pressed snow into every corner of the barn, and the roof groaned under its weight. On the 15th night, the temperature dropped so fast that the trees cracked like dry bones. That was when the knocking came. Martha was mending a torn mitten by firelight when she heard it. 3 sharp thuds on the hatch above them. Not wind, not falling snow. A voice followed. "Martha, please, it's Tom." Lily froze. Martha climbed the ladder slowly and lifted the hatch. Tom Parker stood there with his coat open and his face gray with cold. Behind him were his wife and 2 small children, their cheeks red and wet from crying. "Our chimney collapsed," Tom said. "The house filled with smoke. We tried to fix it, but the fire just keeps coming back inside. The kids can't breathe." Martha looked past him at the dark shapes of their home across the field. She remembered his laughter in the snow. For a moment, no one moved. Then Martha stepped aside. "Bring them in." They crowded down the ladder, blinking in the lantern light. The children huddled close to the fire as soon as they felt its warmth. Tom's wife sank onto the floor, coughing into her sleeve. "It's warm in here," she whispered. Tom stared at the tin panels behind the hearth, the sealed walls, the raised bed. "You built all this?" Martha nodded. "We had to." He lowered his head. "I was wrong about you." Martha didn't answer. She poured water into the skillet and added the last of the dried beans and a small piece of rabbit fat. Lily handed out wooden cups without being asked. They sat together in the firelight. 6 people in a space built for 2. The shelter breathed quietly around them, holding its heat. That night, the Parker children slept near the fire, wrapped in spare coats and rabbit pelts. Lily gave up her place on the bed and curled beside her mother on the floor. In the morning, Tom climbed back to his house to repair the chimney. When he returned, he carried a sack of flour and a jar of salt. "For what you gave us," he said. Martha accepted them without pride. Supplies were supplies. Word spread. 2 days later, another family came. Then another. Not to stay, but to ask questions. How did the smoke rise? Why didn't the walls sweat? How did the fire burn so long? Martha showed them. She explained heat and air, and the way earth could hold warmth if treated right. Lily listened and repeated the lessons like they were stories. "You're teaching the cold to leave you alone," Lily said one night. Martha smiled at that, but fear still lingered. One morning, Martha climbed out and saw the barn roof sagging under fresh snow. The old beams groaned as if tired of standing. She hurried back down and moved their stored wood into the corridor. That evening, the roof gave way. Snow and broken boards collapsed inward, but the hatch held, buried beneath a slanted drift. The shelter stayed whole. Above them, the barn became a pile of ruin. Below them, the fire kept burning. Martha sat beside Lily and listened to the wind roar where walls had once stood. "They laughed at us for living underground," Lily said. Martha tightened her arm around her. "They didn't know what the ground could do." Outside, winter still ruled the land. Inside, they had built something stronger than judgment. Winter didn't end quickly. It never does in Mill Creek. The snow stayed thick on the fields, and the wind still swept down from the hills like it meant to erase every road and fence. But inside the shelter, time had changed. The walls were dry now. The fire burned clean and steady. Rabbit pelts hung from wooden pegs like quiet trophies of survival. A narrow shelf held their few tools in careful order. The space no longer felt borrowed. It felt earned. One morning, Martha climbed up to clear the hatch and saw a familiar figure standing near the broken barn. Frank. He looked smaller than she remembered, thinner. His coat was too light for the cold. "I heard you were out here," he said, "living underground." Martha stood in the snow, her breath turning white between them. "We're living," she replied. He glanced at the collapsed barn, and then at the faint line of smoke rising from the hidden vent. "You don't have to do this. You can come back. I can try again." Martha thought of the quiet nights by the fire, the way Lily had learned to tend flames and count supplies, the way fear had turned into routine. "We already tried," she said gently. "This works." Frank nodded once. Like a man who understood too late, he left without arguing. That evening, Lily sat on the bed brushing her doll's yarn hair. "Was that my dad?" "Yes." "Is he mad?" "No," Martha said. "He's just cold in a different way." The deep freeze came in the 6th week. Temperatures dropped so low that even sound seemed to crack in the air. Houses in town burned through their wood. Chimneys failed again. People remembered the hole in the ground that stayed warm. They didn't laugh anymore. Sometimes they brought food. Sometimes they asked advice. Sometimes they just stood near the hatch and listened to the fire breathe. One night, Lily looked at the curved dirt wall and said, "Do you think the ground knows us now?" Martha smiled. "I think it learned how to hold us." Spring came quietly, not with green grass, but with softer wind, with water dripping from the trees instead of snapping off them. The snow thinned. The sun stayed longer. Martha opened the hatch and felt warm air touch her face for the first time in months. They could have gone back to town. They didn't. They planted a small garden near the old barn ruin. They patched the shelter roof with boards from the fallen beams. They widened the smoke vent. They made the space brighter. Lily painted a crooked sun on the wall with charcoal and clay. "This is our house," she said. And it was. Not because it was underground, not because it was clever, but because it had kept them alive when nothing else would. Now let me ask you, would you have walked away from a broken home in the middle of winter? Would you trust the earth to protect your child? And if the world mocked you for surviving differently, would you keep going anyway? If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more emotional survival stories like this one. Stories about courage, family, and finding warmth where no one else thought it could exist. Because sometimes the strongest homes are built in the most unexpected places.